The sack shouldn't have been moving. Caleb Torrens pulled his horse to a dead stop, dust swirling around the mare's hooves as he stared at the burlap bundle lying in the middle of the dirt road. At first glance, it looked like grain or feed, something fallen from a wagon, but grain didn't shift. Grain didn't make the faint, muffled sounds that drifted across the empty stretch of desert between Millfield and nowhere. He dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with deliberate quiet. The sun hung merciless overhead, casting everything in harsh shadows and brutal light. Nothing moved for miles except the heat shimmer rising from the rocks and the occasional buzzard circling high above. This was the kind of emptiness that swallowed men whole, where secrets got buried and stayed buried. The sack moved again, a weak, desperate struggle from within. Caleb approached with the caution of a man who'd survived 3 range wars and countless bar fights. His hand rested on his Colt, not drawn but ready. In this territory, anything unexpected usually meant trouble, and trouble had a way of multiplying like prairie fire. He knelt beside the burlap, noting the crude rope tied around the opening. The fabric was stained with something dark, not blood, but dirt, and something else he couldn't place. His weathered fingers worked at the knots, and as the rope loosened, he heard it again. A voice, small, broken, barely a whisper. "Mama?" Caleb's hands froze on the rope. His heart hammered against his ribs as he processed what he'd heard. The voice was young, a child's voice. Someone had tied a child in a sack and left them to die in the desert sun. He tore at the rope with renewed urgency, his calloused hands working frantically until the burlap fell away. What he found inside made his blood run cold and his soul catch fire all at once. A girl, maybe 6 years old, curled tight, as a frightened animal. Her dress was torn and filthy, her dark hair matted with dust and tears. But it was her eyes that hit him like a physical blow, wide, terrified, but still holding a spark of defiance that reminded him of someone he'd tried hard to forget. She looked up at him and whispered again, "Mama?" Caleb Torrens had seen men hanged, shot, and left for dead. He'd witnessed atrocities that would haunt most folks to their graves. But sitting in that empty road with a half-dead child looking at him with hope he didn't deserve, he felt something crack open inside his chest that he'd thought was sealed forever. "Easy now," Caleb murmured, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "You're safe." The girl didn't respond, just stared at him with those enormous dark eyes. He could see she was dehydrated, probably hadn't eaten in days. Her lips were cracked, her small hands trembling. Someone had done this deliberately, tied her up and abandoned her, to die slow and alone. He reached for his canteen, moving slowly so as not to spook her further. "Can you drink some water?" She nodded slightly, and he helped her take small sips. As she drank, he studied her features more carefully. Mixed blood, Apache and white, he'd guess. In this part of Texas, that heritage alone could get a child killed. The recent Apache raids had left the territory on edge, with fear and hatred running so deep that innocent lives got swept up in the violence. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Anna," she whispered, then added with heartbreaking hope, "Where's my mama?" Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough abandoned children to know the likely answer to that question, but he wasn't about to crush what little hope she had left. Not yet. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him look up sharply. A dust cloud was rising in the distance. Riders coming from the direction of Millfield. His mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. If these were the people who dumped Anna, they wouldn't be pleased to find her alive. If they were townspeople, they might not take kindly to finding him with an Apache child. "We need to go," he said, scooping Anna into his arms. She was lighter than she should be, all sharp angles and fragile bones. "Hold on tight." He mounted his horse with practiced ease, settling Anna in front of him. She leaned against his chest, and he felt the rapid flutter of her heartbeat through her thin dress. The approaching riders were getting closer. He could make out individual horses now, maybe 4 or 5 men riding hard. As he spurred his mare toward the rocky outcropping ahead, Caleb made a choice that would change everything. He could have left Anna by the roadside, could have told the approaching riders he'd found nothing. It would have been safer, smarter. He had his own reputation to think about, his own skin to preserve. Instead, he held the child tighter and rode toward the hills, toward trouble he couldn't yet imagine. Behind them, the dust cloud grew larger, and the sound of pursuit echoed across the desert like thunder before a storm. The cave Caleb found was little more than a crack in the rock face, but it was hidden from the main trail and offered shelter from both sun and searching eyes. He helped Anna dismount, noting how she stayed close to his side, her small hand clutching his shirt sleeve. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice barely audible in the cool shadow of the rocks. Caleb studied her face, the delicate features, the mix of heritage that marked her as belonging to two worlds and welcomed by neither. "Because leaving you there wasn't right," he said. Simply. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. Caleb peered through a gap in the rocks and counted 5 riders. He recognized the lead horse, a big gray stallion that belonged to Dutch Morrison, the self-appointed leader of Millfield's vigilante committee. Morrison was a hard man who saw Apache blood as a stain that needed washing away. "She's got to be around here somewhere," Morrison's voice carried clearly in the desert air. "Tom saw Torrance stop right about where we left her." Anna pressed closer to Caleb, her eyes wide with terror. She knew these voices, he realized. These were the men who'd tied her in that sack. "Maybe she wandered off and died," another voice suggested. "Sun like this would finish a kid pretty quick." "We need to be sure," Morrison replied. "Can't have any loose ends walking back to town with stories." Caleb's hand moved to his gun. 5 against 1 weren't odds he liked, especially with a child to protect. But Anna tugged on his sleeve, shaking her head urgently. "They killed Mama," she whispered, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. "They said she was a traitor for marrying Papa. They said I was a mistake that needed fixing." The words hit Caleb like physical blows. He'd known men capable of such cruelty, but hearing it from a 6-year-old child made his vision blur with rage. These weren't soldiers fighting a war. They were cowards who murdered women and children in the name of justice. The hoofbeats were getting closer. Morrison's men were searching methodically, checking every possible hiding spot. It was only a matter of time before they found the cave. "Listen to me," Caleb whispered urgently to Anna. "Whatever happens, you stay hidden. You understand? No matter what you hear, you don't come out until I tell you it's safe." She nodded, but her grip on his shirt tightened. "Don't leave me," she pleaded. "I won't," he promised, though they both knew it might be a lie. "But if something happens to me, you wait until dark, then head north to the mission. Tell Father Miguel that Caleb Torrance sent you." The sound of voices was right outside now. Caleb checked his pistol, knowing that in moments he'd have to make a choice between his own life and the promise he'd made to a dying child's hope. "Found something!" The shout came from directly above their hiding spot. Caleb tensed, ready to step into the open and draw their fire away from Anna, but the voice continued. "Horse tracks, but they're old. Probably nothing." Anna pressed her face against Caleb's shoulder, her small body trembling. In the dim light of the cave, he could see the exhaustion etched in her young features, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from losing everything that mattered. "Your papa," he whispered softly. "What was his name?" "James Crawford," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "He was a good man. Mama said he saw people's hearts, not their faces." Caleb's breath caught. He'd known a James Crawford, a former cavalry officer who'd left the army in disgust over the treatment of Apache civilians. Crawford had settled near Millfield with his Apache wife, trying to build a life between two worlds. Caleb had respected the man's courage, even if others called it foolishness. "He taught me to read," Anna continued, her voice growing stronger with the memory. "Said words had power, that knowing them meant nobody could ever make me small." She reached into the torn pocket of her dress and pulled out a small leather journal, its pages worn and water-stained. "Mama gave me this before they came. She said to remember the stories." Caleb opened the journal carefully. The pages were filled with a woman's neat handwriting, stories, poems, observations about desert life and the changing seasons. But it was the inscription on the first page that made his heart clench. "For Anna, my brave girl, your story is just beginning. Love, Maria Crawford." The hoofbeats outside were moving away, but Caleb barely noticed. He was thinking about a woman he had never met who'd died trying to protect her daughter's future, about a man who had died defending his family's right to exist, about all the small acts of love and courage that happened in the shadows while the world raged on in its cruelty. "She was beautiful," Anna said, noticing his attention to the journal, "and smart. Papa said she could speak 4 languages and knew every plant that grew in the desert. She taught me which ones heal and which ones hurt." "She sounds like she was remarkable," Caleb said, and meant it. Anna looked up at him with those two wise eyes. Why do people hate us so much? We never hurt anybody. It was the question Caleb had been asking himself since he found her. The hatred that had killed her parents and nearly killed her wasn't born from any real threat. It came from fear and ignorance, from people who needed someone to blame for their own failures and disappointments. Some folks, he said finally, are so afraid of their own shadows that they lash out at anything different. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it real. The sound of retreating horses finally faded completely. They were alone again, but Caleb knew their safety was temporary at best. 3 hours passed before Caleb deemed it safe enough to leave the cave. Anna had fallen asleep against his shoulder, clutching her mother's journal like a lifeline. He carried her to his horse, careful not to wake her, and began the long ride toward the mission. Father Miguel was tending his small garden when they arrived. The old priest took one look at Anna's sleeping form and ushered them inside without questions. It was only after Anna was fed and bathed and tucked into a clean bed that he asked Caleb for the full story. "Morrison and his men will come looking eventually," the priest said when Caleb finished. "They can't afford to let her live." "I know," Caleb replied. "That's why she can't stay here long." Father Miguel nodded slowly. "I have a sister in California. She runs a school for children like Anna, children caught between worlds. It would be a good life for her." Over the next week, Caleb made arrangements. He sold his horse and gear, keeping only enough money for supplies and travel. The rest he gave to Father Miguel for Anna's journey west. He would escort her personally to California, see her safely settled before returning to face whatever consequences waited in Texas. The morning they left the mission, Anna gave him something, a small stone she'd polished smooth with a symbol carved carefully into its surface. "Mama taught me that symbol," she said. "It means protector. She said someday I'd know who deserved to carry it." Caleb looked down at the stone, then at the girl who had somehow managed to survive the worst humanity could offer while keeping her capacity for trust intact. "I'm not sure I deserve this," he said. "Mama said the people who deserve things most are the ones who think they don't," Anna replied, with a wisdom far beyond her years. The journey to California took 3 weeks. Anna proved to be resilient company, asking questions about everything they passed and sharing stories from her mother's journal. By the time they reached the school, Caleb had grown so attached to the girl that leaving her felt like tearing away part of himself. But Anna was ready. She hugged him fiercely at the school gates, then walked away without looking back, her small shoulders straight and her mother's journal tucked securely under her arm. Years later, when people asked Caleb Torrens about his greatest moment, he never mentioned the range wars he'd survived or the men he'd faced down in Dusty Street. He talked about a moving sack on an empty road and the choice to do right when nobody was watching. Anna Crawford grew up to become a teacher herself, carrying her mother's stories and her own hard-won wisdom to children who needed to believe that goodness still existed in the world. She never forgot the cowboy who'd stopped for a stranger's sack and stayed to save a stranger's soul. In her desk drawer, she kept a worn leather journal and a smooth stone carved with a symbol for protector, reminders that sometimes the most important stories begin with the smallest acts of courage. Stories like this aren't just told, they're felt. If you felt it too, subscribe and stay with us.